Hello, everyone. Welcome to The Unpredictable. In this podcast, we are going to visit the world of poetry, and we are going to discuss some heavy topics in it. Of course, you will hear an unpredictable thing and the way how to deal with it at the end of this podcast. And the spoken word poet, Fareh Malik, will be with us. Fareh is the winner of 2022 RBC Pan Canada New Voices Award. He is also the winner of Hamilton Arts Shirley Elford Prize, and there is more. You will see his exceptional poetry in his book, Streams That Lead Somewhere. It was published a year ago, and I highly recommend you to have a look at it, if you haven't yet. Yeah, welcome, Fareh. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
So, Fareh, here is my first question. Once I read your bio on your website, I saw a note explaining how you stepped into storytelling and poetry when you were a high school student. It says, Thursday with a desire to bring about change. Do you say that writing poems and making them public have quenched that thirst? Or do you feel more thirsty now as you have found a way to express your feelings with your writing?
That's a great question, and something that I don't think I've thought directly about before, but the first thing that comes to my brain is that if you are, I'm just going to speak in my own experience, that when I was writing, and so, in my bio, that's kind of alluding to the fact that I was trying to do like music, and I had a friend who kind of said, "Hey, what you're writing in your music is very, sometimes is very political, or it's very specific to, social justice. So have you thought about doing spoken word?" And that was kind of pivot to something that I thought could be more directly about social change and trying to accomplish that. As for whether I think that it's quenched or it's still not quenched yet, I think that it feels like drinking ocean water.
Oh my God, that's a great definition. So can you please elaborate it a bit?
Yeah, I think it's like, I've been so thirsty for it, and it's been this something that's been right in front of me that I could drink, and very short term it's quenched the thirst. But as soon as there's some sort of something that happens, and without elaborating too much, I will say that, it's been a hard time lately for the Muslim community. There's always something that's happening in the world that goes, wow, I'm thirstier than I was before. And yes, it helps me quench my thirst, but the more that I can see that I can bring about change, the more that I realize that the voice and platform I have is special, and I'm more motivated to use it to bring that about even further.
Thank you, Fareh, for this impressive answer. And I believe poetry is a different world, something like so naive and so fragile. In this world, you're touching on some heavy topics. You're saying something hard to say. And the important thing is that saying uncomfortable things comes with a risk. Sometimes the message you want to extend might ruin the soul of the poem. What I see in your book, Streams That Lead Somewhere, you have a great balance. How do you keep that balance alive? What's the way to do that?
I think that when I approached creating Streams That Lead Somewhere, I approached it in a way that I want this book to really represent me as a human being. And so by that, I mean that if you haven't read the book, for anyone watching this, it follows this path that goes from streams to somewhere. And it has this trajectory that explores growth and explores overcoming things. And the way that I represented that as myself, or just my real life experiences. And I feel like balance is something that I've had to really master in my life in order to be here today. And so what that looked like is, for every poem that was 2 steps back, am I writing 2 poems that are a step forward? Or am I writing 1 poem that's 2 steps forward? And so having tones and themes and experiences that kind of balance each other out and say, yeah, well, what happened on Tuesday was horrific, but here's how I'm pushing forward on Wednesday. I think is how I sort of attack it when I'm writing to represent who I am as a person. And I think that it brings a really healthy way to read the book, because I wanted to make sure that if I was going to explore a path where it starts off kind of darker and then it goes into a more optimistic place, when you start reading the book, that you don't feel super depressed.
Yes.
So it was important for me to put the manuscript together in a way that still had comic relief in some points, still had the one that I always get flagged for is people read, I think it's my poem about Islamophobia, which is like, it's a dense paragraph of just like Islamophobic experiences. And then the next poem over is like 4 lines, and it says, Islamophobia isn't so bad. When I switch out my beanie for a kufi, I get a whole booth to myself on the train. And so it's just about that, right? It's about making the reader feel like, it's not cumbersome to get through it, but still really representing those experiences and autobiographical events.
So, Fareh, if you don't mind, I would like to read the last lines of the poem, I don't cry often, but when I do. And then I will ask my question. Here is those great lines. The man on the corner is yelling at me and my father, go back to your country. But my flesh is of this, oh here. And for the next decade, I will be confused about what home really means. So, Fareh, what home really means? Have you got an answer for that?
That's the question. It's funny because I'm at a conference right now called the Mosquers. And it's a conference that brings together like the Muslim diaspora and allies of the Muslim diaspora. And that's such a question that is not just representative of so many first and second generation immigrants, but so many different cultural communities have this question of what does home mean? And this is something that I'm actually excited to talk about because it's something that I'm trying to figure out as I am putting together my second book. So my second book tentatively is being called We Celebrate the Rain. And it is a book that explores that exact question. What is the analysis of someone who, I go to school and I either have a slight Desi accent in my voice because I'm speaking so much Urdu at home with my parents.
Yes.
Or I don't have that accent, but I go home and I'm starting to lose my native tongue. And so my parents are like, hey, practice your Urdu. And then I have an accent, I'm going to go get bullied. So this balance of staying loyal and true to your cultural ideals, but being told by your country to conform, you won't get a job if you do this, you're going to get bullied or you're going to get judged if you do that. And so that's what the book is about, is how do you find home within 2 different homes that are trying to rip you apart. So I will say that it's something I'm still navigating, it's something I'm still finding, but the best, and honestly it's a little bit cheesy, but the best answer I can say is that the most comfortable home I've found has been a breed of people, my significant other, my family, like these are homes to me that make me feel like I can be both of those worlds and myself. I think there's a point where you're trying to decide who you want to be and you don't even know who you want to be. And then your body doesn't feel like a home in that sense. But I'm at a point where, I'm almost 30 years old and I know very clearly who I am and what I stand for and what I do well, what I don't do well. And that makes my brain, that makes my body feel like a home that I'm very comfortable in these days. So yeah, I guess that's the best way that I'm navigating it right now.
Thank you, Fareh, for this generous answer. In daily life, being an immigrant means you are telling people about yourself, about your story over and over, even if you don't want to. I mean, at your school, at the hospital, at the moment being introduced to someone as well. Besides, generally, you have to mention some negative things by doing that because mostly immigrant people have some negative stories, Have you ever thought finding yourself in a necessity like that is a bit frustrating, or do you always find a motivation to do that?
I mean, I think the ideal answer here is like, yes, of course, I'm always motivated to tell my story because in the face of injustice, I am going to, be the change maker. But the reality is that it's draining. There are, a lot of experiences I've had that have made me completely shut down, something that's happened directly to me or my family, whether that's something that's happened to my community. Even recently, like this past week has been something really hard to navigate and sit down and think about all the suffering that's going on has been tough. So a part of me, a part of my brain thinks, come on, like jump in the ring. Maybe you're the person that's gonna write a poem that people feel, they resonate with worldwide.
You are talking about the things going on, the bad things going on in Gaza, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
Um,
unfortunately.
and it's tough to talk about because it's been happening for like 56 years long
Yeah.
years. And so to have that going on and then see that suffering and going, am I going to turn this into something productive for the world? Am I going to try to be helpful in some way? And in the past, I've done that, right? Like in the past, in the last wave of bombing in Gaza, I started a poetry reading fundraiser and we raised thousands of
Mhm.
dollars to send for shelter. But sometimes it hits you and sometimes you get drained, and it's really, really hard to motivate yourself to get into that ring. So I'd love to say that I'm always ready to attack
Mhm.
opportunity, but truth is that it does take a lot of resilience. It takes a lot of reconciling what's going on and moving past that trauma, especially when it's something that's happened so personally to me. And you've read the book, you know that everything in the book is autobiographical. So writing about those things, making them public, is a big thing that no one ever thinks about. When you're writing and publishing poetry, now everyone knows my experiences. They know everything I'm talking about. So yeah, it takes a lot of work to get there, but I think when I eventually do get there, it's something that I feel is so worthwhile.
So Fareh, let's talk about something else. I mean, yes, you are shedding a light on some difficult issues like Islamophobia and racism on your work. But yeah, of course, your poetry has something else beautiful. Let's talk about love in your poetry. I'm going to give an example, especially on the 20th page, and painted your smile into my eyelids. I really liked it. That's a great line. So I see a great definition of love here, actually. You are having us to feel a strong wind of love in our faces with strong lines. And I see the pain of farewells and somehow losing your sweetheart or your lover, even though there is many beautiful promises. So does even those strong loves evaporate sooner or later? Or our hearts keep that feeling inside permanently? Because the last line says, I wish I could have loved you a little while longer. Does that mean that big love has ended, or there's still a fire instead of ashes?
Yeah. And I will say this, me and my significant other, who, a lot of my love lines and poems are still together,
Yeah.
going strong. But I will say this, and this is how I approach love poetry, because I don't really classify myself as a love poet, but I do love to write about love. So Maulana Rumi, the legendary poet, wrote about love in a way that the Western world now understands that he was writing about. The misconception is that he's writing about a lover or a partner. The real answer is that he was writing about his relationship with God. And that is not to say that that's what I'm doing, but what I learned from Rumi was I could write about love in a way that is sometimes romantic, is sometimes platonic, is sometimes about my late grandmother, because these are all different forms of love for me. Sometimes even it's a love poem to myself. And so, yeah, there's some lines in some poems where I'm directly talking about romantic love. But for example, I wish I could have just loved you a little while longer. That line to me represented a few different levels of love relationships. One of them was, how do I talk about loss? I lost my grandmother and she was very close to me. And so that's a love relationship that I lost entirely.
Mhm.
Okay. And then I've been in situations where I have a love relationship with, a parent who I've almost lost. And in that moment that I've almost lost them, having to deal with the concept of losing that person who's incredibly close to me. How do I conceptualize that feeling? And then third, romantic love. Yeah, like if we were to break up, how does that feel? And that specific line isn't about breakup because we're still together, but actually it more so felt like I was writing it about the quarantine, because we were separated for a long, long time. And so leaving the city that we shared, because I went back to live with, stay with my family over the quarantine, and
Yeah.
so did she. And so this like almost being separated and being pulled apart and saying, I wish we could have had a little bit more time before, this happened, is kind of where I was coming at from a romantic lens. And so, yeah, so I think that when you're reading through anything I'm writing of love, or even just anything, I think I'm attacking it through multiple levels that address a lot of different things, relationships in my life. And it's funny that you mentioned that, because I think when she read that poem for the first time, she said, "Are we breaking up?" And I was like, no. Oh, it's just symbolic. So
Wow, okay. Yeah, but this point is so interesting. The quarantine. I mean, I believe that period, that quarantine period, was an executioner of tons of relationships. I don't know if you feel in that way, but I saw many relationships has ended just because of that quarantine.
yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah. Okay. So, for you mentioned you are working on a new book. Yeah, is it going to be poetry again?
It's going to
Or
be ideally a fusion of poetry and creative nonfiction.
oh, okay.
So I'm going to incorporate, essays and short stories into it as well.
Mhm.
Similar to, well, there's a bunch of books that are like that, but I really want to have it so that it's tackling specific themes through, essay and poetry, and then next chapter essay and poetry about something else, and so you get kind of this. The thing that I love about poetry is that you get to place the reader in the shoes of the person. And so when I write something like, "You never know how scared you are," or "You never know how," I don't know my own lines, but you never realize how big a 9 millimeter barrel is Black Ocean wide, and when you're scared enough. And so that puts you into the shoes of, you're staring down the barrel of this gun, and it's tiny, but it looks huge because that's all you can see. And so poetry has this wonderful ability to put the reader in those shoes. But one of the things that I find with my poetry is that I don't get to explain circumstance as well as I would like a lot of the time. And so I thought, well, what if I could write about a topic from both angles? And so I could hit it with the really emotional and metaphorical imagery that puts the reader right in the shoes, and then they can read exactly what inspired that poem, what the experiences and background was in like an essay or short story format.
So, Fareh, here is my last question. What is your unpredictable thing? You never forget about it, and how did you deal with it? Is there any experience like that you can share with us?
Yes, because it's a traumatic thing for me, I'm not going to go into super detail. I will say that, a family member had two back-to-back really, really terrible medical tragedies. Being diagnosed with a sickness requiring surgical intervention, and then that medical system that's trying to save her almost killing them. That was one of the most stressful and traumatic experiences of my life, having to deal with that. And especially from an age, because I've been young, where like my family has had things like this happen before, like medical mishaps and things like that. But I was so young that people baby you and they go, "Don't worry, it's gonna be fine." But I was old enough that no one was doing that for me, and I had to stand on my own 2 feet and say, "Here's what we're gonna do," and be that coordinator. That was something that happened dead set in the middle of my writing practice, and I think whenever I sat down, and it still happens to me, I'm not going to say that, hey, everyone, completely past everything. It's not linear, your progress a lot of the time. Whenever I would sit down at my laptop after the fact, when, everything down, I couldn't get words out onto whatever I was writing without my mind flooding with images of what had happened. And I think that emotional progression is such an important method of informing your artistry. And what I mean by that is that if you don't get to a healthy place, and maybe you do, but like this is for me at least, if I don't get to a healthy place with my experiences, with my emotions, then I'll either not be able to write, or my writing becomes very much a trauma dump. And that for me isn't healthy, because talking about it in that way is not healthy. I like to talk about things in the perspective of, yeah, here's a negative circumstance, but here's how I'm moving past it, and here's how I'm growing. And so, seeking therapy and seeking counseling and, overcoming what we've been told our whole life as, oh, you're a man, that you shouldn't be seeking this help, and you shouldn't cry, and you shouldn't be emotional, are all things that I'm unlearning. I used to brag. I used to brag in high school that, yeah, I don't cry. I've never cried. I'm a robot. And I didn't know so much later how toxic that is. So yeah, I think this unpredictable things can happen in your life, right? Like you can get hit by a hurricane out of nowhere. Anyone who tells you that it can't happen is lying. Will it happen? Maybe not, but it definitely can. It's happened to me. And I think that if you are trying to move past it and be better after the fact, it takes a lot of emotional growing, emotional maturity, and stabilizing yourself. So that's my way of kind of dealing with it. And I actually wrote a poem recently about that experience called, well, I don't know what the name is for sure yet, but my document's name is We Are Okay. And it's basically, so I was very sick in high school.
Yes.
And I believe the doctor told my parents that, like, he might not make it. They never found out what it was. It was like some weird thing. I was actually paralyzed. My body was paralyzed.
Wow, that was so serious. Oh my God.
Yeah. My joints filled with fluid, and I couldn't move any of my fingers, my knees, anything. And so, and the medical thing I'm kind of talking about is that my mom was diagnosed with cancer a few years back. And so I wrote these like two poems side by side.
Yes.
That is about my mom comforting me when I'm sick, and then me comforting my mom when she was. But that's such an, like, when I read it back, I go, wow, like high school me could never have been so okay with his own experiences that he would have brought this out. And so I'm just thankful that I'm at a place in my life where I can do that. And I'm at an emotional maturity in my life that I can take these things and make everyone's life a little bit better for it. So yeah, that's why, that's how.
Wow. Fareh, thank you for sharing this deep and serious experiences and very impressive way to deal with them. Also, thank you for your all generous answers. It was a great conversation to me. Thank you very much for being with us, Fareh.
Thank you for having me. This has been awesome. And thank you for reading the book. I really appreciate the support, and your questions were amazing. They really made me think.
Oh, thank you. I mean, mentioning your book, I would love to say it again, dear listeners. If you haven't yet, please have a look at it. You're going to see very lovely and very deep poems in it. Dear listeners, if you hear my words now, you have listened to this episode all the way to the end, and thank you. Please don't forget to hit the follow button on the main page. Please don't forget to like and share this episode. And please come back next Monday. My guest and I will be here.